1994, the video game industry was forever changed when the Sony Playstation was released in Japan. Although Nintendo managed to regain its crown, little did they expect that PlayStation would dominate the world and become a part of pop culture, something Nintendo was familiar with in the 1980s. Fans already know that the PlayStation was initially supposed to be a Super Nintendo CD-ROM add-on, but after Nintendo's betrayal, according to Sony that is, Sony was determined to release its own console and compete with Nintendo. PlayStation became the best-selling video game home console of all time before the release of PlayStation 2, surpassing the original Nintendo Entertainment System and solidifying Sony as the top player in the industry. So what if the PlayStation was never launched, and Sony decided that it was too costly and risky of a venture to enter the market? What would happen to the video game industry? Nintendo would win the first great console wars. By 1995, Nintendo had overtaken Sega on the global market, making it king of the gaming industry once again. But Sega had a strong hold in America. While Sega would release its Saturn system in Japan in 1994, it's possible that they would have released the Saturn in North America a little later. Saturn was launched right after the surprising announcement at E3 1995, but this was likely a reaction to Sony's PlayStation. Although Sega would have had a head start, the Nintendo 64's launch in 1996 would likely beat Sega. Sega had been releasing so many hardware units after the Genesis that they began to lose consumer confidence. The Sega Game Gear, Sega CD, 32X, announcement of the Neptune, Nomad, and the lack of support for such platforms, whether consoles, handhelds, or add-ons, was a cause of concern. The 32X was very promising at first, giving gamers an opportunity to upgrade their Sega Genesis to a 32-bit system, but it lacked support from developers, had poor sound, and was a failure in the market. Even with Neptune announced that would combine Genesis and 32X into one system, the launch of the platform was planned to launch after Saturn, and Saturn was already a next-generation system. Neptune was cancelled, which further lost consumer confidence. It's our belief that Nintendo would have won the console wars by the end of 1995. 3D gaming revolution would have been delayed. While video game developers were quickly moving to 3D gaming, especially on PC instead of the old 2D style of graphics, Sega would attempt to try to gain more of a market share with Saturn's launch. Even if the launch was delayed till fall of 1995, the 3D revolution would have been delayed. The problem with Saturn was that it was originally designed to be more of an advanced 32-bit 2D console rather than a 3D system. In fact, the system was originally designed with only one video display processor, which would mean it was already limited in 3D capability and would have likely continued on as a more powerful 2D system. It was when Sega realized the power of the PlayStation that they decided to add a second video display processor to improve 2D performance and eventually tried to get developers to focus on 3D graphics on such a platform. Sega Saturn might not have been a 3D console. It's entirely possible that based on the original architecture plans of the Saturn, that without Sony entering the market, they would have left only one video display processor in the Saturn, and that the system would have been more of a 2D system versus that of a 3D console. With Nintendo already developing Project Reality, they were set on getting to 3D gaming, and with the release of the Nintendo 64, we would have seen 3D games. However, keep in mind that one of the first games they thought of for the system was Killer Instinct, an advanced 2D game. It's possible that Nintendo would have still be making some 2D games for the N64, but ones that were far more improved with some 3D effects. Sega could still be making consoles today. Despite consumer confidence fading away by the end of 1995, it's a strong possibility that Sega would still be making video game consoles, even in 2020, instead of being just a gaming developer. The Dreamcast was its last big hope to challenge the PlayStation and Nintendo. And without the PlayStation, it would have brought in the so-called 128-bit era during the height of Nintendo 64's run early and give Nintendo a real challenge. Nintendo was far behind trying to get a Nintendo 128 developed with silicon graphics, but it never happened, and they had to go with IBM and Ardex for Project Dolphin. With Sega being the only other challenger to Nintendo, it's likely that they would still be making video game systems today if there was no new entrant. Sega's comeback. While there were legacy console wars in the past, the most heated console war ever was the great console war between Nintendo and Sega in the 16-bit era. Gaming historians would argue that the console wars came into an end with Sony Playstation 2. Even with PlayStation 3 facing stiff competition from its rivals, the new and previous generation of consoles saw Nintendo go in a different direction, and Microsoft and Sony sharing architecture design. making the console wars less about architecture but more about software, brand, or choice. It's unlike the 16-bit days. We argue without the PlayStation, a second-grade console war would emerge between Nintendo and Sega. For one, the Dreamcast was a CD-based system or GD-ROM, something Nintendo 64 wasn't. Even though Saturn was also CD-based, it was quite limited. It's our theory that developers would have rushed to the Dreamcast due to its capabilities, since it would have offered more storage capacity on disk. Dreamcast originally lacked developer support, forcing Sega to focus on its own sports brand. But without Sony, it's possible that companies like EA would have stuck around with Dreamcast. Keep in mind, during the first PlayStation era, the biggest game changer was Final Fantasy VII. Developers like Square may have shifted Final Fantasy on Saturn due to the use of CD-ROM and taken notice to the Dreamcast. Another big game changer in the PlayStation 2 era was Grand Theft Auto 3. In fact, GTA 3 is believed to have been in development for the Dreamcast, and without the PlayStation, it would have likely been released on Dreamcast, but somewhat watered down in comparison to what we got on the PlayStation 2. If that was the case with two possible big-name games on a Sega platform, they would see a comeback that beats Nintendo to the punch. Nintendo really wasn't a fan of GTA-style games at the time and had a poor relationship with Square. There would be no Xbox. While a third entrant in the video game industry is always possible, it's our theory that the Xbox might not exist without the PlayStation. Although there was fear from Microsoft that video game consoles could be a threat to their business, that was largely because of PlayStation 2, which was meant to be a new home entertainment device capable of playing DVD movies and could potentially replace PCs one day. Without PlayStation, it's possible that Microsoft would not have seen the threat at all. At the same time, Microsoft had a partnership with Sega when they released Windows CE for the Dreamcast for developers. It's possible that if Dreamcast continued on, Microsoft could find new business working with Sega in the future. Even though a DirectX system concept was thought of in 1998, the meeting with Gates by the DirectX team in 1999 might have actually gone downhill, since the threat was no longer there. Nintendo and Sega would be seen as just simply toy manufacturers, where these two companies were just not interested in expansion into home entertainment. It's also unlikely that Nintendo would have had DVD playback for the GameCube. Perhaps Sega's post-Dreamcast console might have had DVD playback. With Nintendo and Sega competing in the continuing console war, the transition to home entertainment, as we saw with the PlayStation and Xbox brands, would either be delayed or almost non-existent. Though, with the rise of web TVs to smart devices, it may make Nintendo and Sega reconsider what a console could be. Nintendo and Sega competing for power over gameplay. If Nintendo and Sega continued to compete against each other, it would be more about the power of a system and graphics than about gameplay. It's entirely possible that Nintendo would never come out with the Wii or Switch. We're not trying to say a company like Nintendo would not try to be innovative, but without a mega corporation like Sony or Microsoft in the market with deep pockets, Nintendo's strategy would likely differ, and we would have gotten more powerful systems from them to keep up with Sega. Online gaming. Though Xbox Live was revolutionary, we feel that online gaming would still be around, since Sega had already started its own online platform known as SegaNet during the Dreamcast era. Interestingly enough, Microsoft participated with Sega with their own online platform before the launch of SegaNet, and we feel that if the Xbox never happened, well, perhaps Microsoft and Sega would have continued their relationship, and SegaNet would be an alternative to what Xbox Live became. Nintendo wasn't so much interested in online gaming, but allowed developers to set up their own online platforms so that games like Phantasy Star Online could be played on it, though you'd still needed a 56K modem or broadband adapter for the GameCube. Without PlayStation or Xbox, it's strongly likely that with Sega getting a head start with online gaming, Nintendo may take online gaming more seriously to compete with Sega. Let's be honest, whether you're a fan of one system or another, without PlayStation, we would probably never have a PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X or Nintendo Switch for that matter. Nintendo may not have even tried at innovative gameplay ideas. PlayStation was a real revolution that the gaming industry needed, and we should be thankful for it. Sega may be out of the console manufacturing picture, but has been seeing some financial gains prior to the pandemic, making an important gaming developer. What did you think of this what-if scenario? Comment below, like, subscribe, and thank you for watching In the Plot.